dia a todos. Estamos aqui hoje numa entrevista especialíssima do TUTAMÉIA com Pierre Sané, que foi secretário-geral da Anistia Internacional, hoje é presidente do Imagine Africa Institute do Senegal, que está no Brasil hoje para acompanhar debates sobre a situação da democracia no mundo e no Brasil. E a gente vai começar perguntando muito. Thank you very much for you to join us today.
Thank you.
I would like to begin with a question on democracy in Brazil and the situation about regarding President Lula. What do you see the situation of democracy in Brazil nowadays?
I am, in general, optimistic. I believe that globally, worldwide, there is a global aspiration at the popular level for not just representative democracy, but for participatory democracy. I think throughout the world, people are organizing to assert their human rights, and that includes the right to participate in political life. It is not just politicians and members of parliament and government, but it is ordinary people. It is NGOs, it is all the watchdogs, it is the media, the popular media, it is social media. I don't think that we can go back. That is, there can be resistance from those who control the wealth or those who believe that because they are born in a certain family, it is natural for them to govern and decide for everybody. I think that time has gone. Now, of course, democracy is not something linear in history. It advances, it stops, sometimes goes back, but I think that the arc of progress bends towards justice and towards democracy. People are more educated today throughout the world. Education is spreading, and with education comes knowledge, understanding of what human rights mean, and understanding and determination to hold their leaders accountable. Now, those who traditionally have been ruling because of wealth, because of type of families, because of the power that they had in the past, of course will resist. I mean, we will not have progress just because people want it. People have to organize and to fight for it. And here the key example is in the United States, where President Trump has promised to make America great again, which means make America white again and keep the power in the hands of those who historically ruled the United States. You can't turn the clock back. That's impossible. So in that sense, in the long term, I'm optimistic. But you have circumstances like the one we live now, where you have this resistance from the well-to-do, but we have to overcome that resistance. And we see it in the United States. The arrival of Trump has led to increased resistance. More people are going into politics, people are organizing, more people are resisting, more people are demonstrating, and I think that at the end of the day, the democratic ideal will be preserved and reinforced.
Well, even though that is true, we've seen the growing presence of ultra-right-wing parties, even Nazi parades in Germany. Yep. So how do you see these things, how this can live together with the democracy?
Yes, that is a reaction. I think that some people feel that they are losing their grip on power, their grip on society, and they resist. And they resist and they think that you can turn the clock back. But to me, it's an illusion. I think that the forces of progress are stronger, and this is an obstacle that we have to organize in order to overcome it. I don't think that we can have a return of fascism in power. I just can't see how it will work. I don't think we can have a return to military dictatorship, be it in Latin America or in Africa. Societies are today too complex, and the information and the education and the understanding of the people by and large, I think, make it very complicated for someone to bring in an authoritarian regime. Take the case of Turkey. What Erdogan is doing is imprisoning thousands and thousands of people. But that will not stop the march of democracy. You cannot put the whole population in prison. You cannot kill everybody. And people are not ready today to accept a deprivation of their human rights, which are universally recognized worldwide. So I think it is a phase linked with the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of the financial system. And it is this economic crisis that gives an impetus of those who want a bigger share or who do not want to share with the rest of the population, do not want to share with the rest of the people, to organize, but these are reactionary forces. And I don't think you can take the clock back. This is not how politics work.
But there is a contradiction between capitalism and democracy. It seems to be more clear today.
Yeah.
So is it possible to, how can we overcome this contradiction?
I think it's the power of resistance. That is, unfortunately today, the labor movement and trade unions are weak in many parts of the world. And they have been, to a certain extent, displaced from the centrality of the resistance that they had during the heydays of capitalism. But capitalism itself produces its own resistance, be it new populations that have been freed from the colonial era, be it the new types of workers. We see, for instance, something very interesting in the United States. We had the first strikes of workers in the fast food industry. In London, we had the first strike of cleaners working in hotels and etc. And these are very often migrant population who are not organized, who are the first victims of the capitalist exploitation. But because their level of education is higher than the previous grassroots working class, they are informed. They know that they are being exploited. Then the next step is to organize and to resist. And this is coming. So I look at it from the perspective of the resistance, not from the perspective of the oppression. Oppression will always be there. But to me, it's the quality of the resistance that I see. And I see that all over the world.
Can this resistance be transformed in proposition? I mean, offering the world a new possible world.
That's right.
And because we know we don't have, or the political parties seem to be very weak.
Yeah.
They are not actually a pole of attraction of this resistance.
Exactly.
And so how can this be transformed in proposition?
Exactly. That's the challenge. And yesterday, Mr. Pereira, I think, who is a former minister of Cardoso, said neoliberalism is in crisis, but the problem is that the political left does not have an alternative to neoliberalism. And when the left come into power, They seek an accommodation with neoliberalism. They try to redistribute better. They try to invest in satisfaction of social rights, but they do not have an alternative economic model. And what he has proposed, he says he will send me the documentation, is developmentalism as a new form of economic arrangement. And that's precisely the point, is that the left does not have an alternative to neoliberalism. So that's why the force of proposition that can bind together all these movements that are organizing to resist do not have a proposal, which is why we have all these identity politics. So within the framework of neoliberalism, we are fighting for women's rights, we are fighting against racism, we are fighting against intolerance to LGBTQ, we are fighting against environmental degradation, etc. But we are not fighting for a new system because that has not been produced up to now. Well, we had one with the old communist regime, but it failed because it did not integrate democracy. And I think any alternative system that is proposed must be founded on human rights, democracy, and then we look at a new economic model that satisfies all the social, economic, and cultural rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and guarantees political participation from the lowest level to the highest level, globally. So the new alternative can only be a global alternative, not a national alternative.
What do you think about what's happening in Brazil? Yesterday you talked about President Lula and all this fight. Do you think Lula as a political prisoner? How do you see the situation of Lula in Brazil?
Well, my view is aligned with the view of the UN Human Rights Committee. The UN Human Rights Committee is the highest body when it comes to assessing human rights situation in a given country. It is 18 independent experts elected by all the governments with a mandate that was designed by governments, and their mission is to ensure that the system of mutual accountability between governments in order to uphold all the principles contained in the Declaration and in the Covenant on Civil Political Rights will be respected. And they have said clearly, they have not looked at the case in substance because they didn't have time. So they published an interim request asking the government to allow Lula to campaign from prison and to be a candidate. That is his political right, and that should not be violated. The decision of the government has violated the rights of Lula. Lula, therefore, should be a candidate, and it is a shame that the Brazilian government, a key actor in the international mechanism that allows the world to live in peace, the Brazilian government, who has been a key actor in the construction of this order, is today disregarding a request of the United Nations. That is very bad for Brazil internationally because it will dent its credibility. And tomorrow, Brazil will not have the moral authority to complain about human rights violation in Venezuela or in other countries. A president, a country, a government that sends to jail a former president on trumped-up charges and who refuses to implement a decision of the highest body in the field of protection of human rights loses its credibility and loses respect worldwide. So I hope that eventually, when the final decision comes out, that they will ensure that it is implemented.
But Brazilian government says that the United Nations Committee valid.
Well,
It has no value at all. I mean,
the committee is a mechanism of the United Nations in the field of human rights, and there are several committees. All those committees were set up by the governments. United Nations is 195 governments coming together, negotiating, agreeing, and putting mechanism which they have an obligation to respect. Otherwise, the UN system will not work. So you cannot, as a government, especially in the South, complain that the multilateral system is being weakened by United States, by etc., big powers, and at the same time refuse to respect your own commitment and your own obligations. You are also weakening the multilateral system. So the committee is a committee of experts. Those experts are elected by the different, by all the governments, and the governments, when they ratify a treaty, they commit themselves to respect the decisions of that committee. So you cannot pick and choose. I mean, all the countries are supposed to respect the decisions, and all the members of the committee who are elected by the government are presented by the governments. It's the government who put the names of candidates, and then they sit around the table and they elect who those who will be in the committee for 4 years are going to be. So, I mean, it is not serious, really, and it is not responsible to criticize the body because you don't like its decision, and to undermine the legitimacy of that body, because that body is there to protect our human rights all over the world. It has that mandate. And therefore, if you undermine that legitimacy, you undermine the whole UN system.
Do you see that democracy in Brazil is in danger?
Well, I don't have all the facts, but like I say, I think that progress in the field of democracy and human rights is not linear, and it constantly needs to be defended. I think that the Brazilian society, Brazilian organizations, the trade unions, the MST, youth movement, women movement, the black movement, are certainly stronger today than they were 20 years ago. And I think the quality of that organization and of that resistance is the best protector of human rights and democracy. So I have confidence that the broader resistance movement in Brazil will be capable of imposing, eventually, respect for democracy. Maybe there will be a price to pay, because those who believe that they own the population, that they own the country because of their birth, and it is their birthright to continue to govern Brazil like they did 50 years ago, will not give up easily. So it is a fight. But I trust that the forces of democracy and human rights will prevail.
How do you, I don't know if you have been able to analyze the situation of Rio de Janeiro. What do you think of the military intervention?
And then we have the case of Marielle Franco.
Yeah. Yes. When I was Secretary General of Amnesty International between 1992 and 2001, I used to come to Brazil regularly. And whenever I visited the Rio de Janeiro, I would visit the favelas. So I have a long rapport with the favelas in Rio, in São Paulo, in Porto Alegre, etc. And I remember at that time, we always condemned the use of the military police and the excessive violence, and more importantly, the impunity. Because at the time, I don't know now exactly what is happening, but at the time already, there were no serious investigation, there are no charges, and there is no sanction. So if you have a system of impunity, then you give a blank sheet to the forces of law enforcement to use illegal means in order to maintain law and order. And at the time already, we had concerns at Amnesty of the connections between the military police and the drug traffickers. Fighting drug trafficking is okay, that's the mission, but it's how you do it. You don't do it by killing unarmed people. What is striking is that you have more killings of black youth in Brazil than you have in the United States. But in the United States, it is because it's the United States, it is under scrutiny. Whenever a young black man is killed by the police, especially if he's unarmed, there is an international outcry. But in Brazil, that does not exist because that is not really taken to the international attention, and that is what is needed. I know that the NGOs are doing whatever they can. I know that also maybe the language, because it is in Portuguese, it doesn't reach out to all sectors in international society, but what is needed is really more international exposure of those crimes to shame the government of Rio de Janeiro and other states, and also at the federal level, shame them into action. Because these are the remnants of a racist system that still persist in spite of all the efforts of the Lula government, despite all the rhetoric about racial democracy, et cetera. But what we see on the ground is a legacy of centuries of slavery and racism, which need to be tackled, in my view, by an alliance between the black movement, the progressive movement, and all the other resistance movement in Brazil. They have to make it a central issue. It's not just an issue of black people, it is an issue of human rights. And the response has to be a broad movement that addresses that alongside domestic violence, alongside environmental degradation, because all those phenomena are linked. It's the same system of power that divides, oppresses, abuses the environment, and is based on a macho culture of having, by birth, the right to own and govern Brazilian people.
You cannot accept the analysis that violence is natural or is a fact of life.
Yeah.
I mean,
No. That especially when we say that violence is part of the black life and the black community. This is a community that has suffered from violence for centuries, under slavery, under colonialism, under discrimination, under inequality, etc. And one should not confuse the violence of the drug traffickers with the violence of a whole community in the favelas. People living in the favelas, I've visited them many times, are people who are, they have a dignity. They are overcoming so much obstacle of discrimination and of poverty. But still, whenever I visited, I was welcome, and people were trying just to have a happy life in very difficult circumstances. So it is not the people that should be blamed, it's the system that obliges people to live in these conditions. And survival sometimes in these conditions is survival of the fittest. So they have to use sometimes force, violence in order to survive. So you cannot blame the victim on for the condition in which they are living. It's the responsibility of the state and federal state to lift people out of poverty. And this is what Lula understood. Lula understood that it was an obligation to improve the conditions of living. It was an obligation of the government to satisfy the basic needs and the social, economic, and cultural rights of the people. And that was an obligation of the state. He's one of the first head of states to have taken seriously social, economic, and cultural rights and turned them into an obligation of the government, into a responsibility of the government to ensure that the right to education, the right to health, the right to live, not to live in poverty, etc., that all those rights, which are human rights, will be satisfied by the government.
Yesterday, someone made a comparison between Lula and Mandela. Do you believe that's correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the great achievement of Nelson Mandela, first of all, has been his power to resist, his power to live up to his convictions, his principles, and his insistence for civil political rights of the African people and a non-racial democracy. He says, I'm not fighting to end white domination of black, to live in a world where black will dominate white people. I want a non-racial democracy. And he fought all his life for that, and he received the Nobel Prize. I think that Lula is the same thing. That is, if you look at his whole life, if you look at his engagement throughout his life, if you look at his convictions, at his principles, which have never changed, even after he left the presidency. I visited his institute 2 days ago and looked at the various projects, including one called Initiativa Africa. His commitment to Africa is there. When here he developed the Bolsa Familia, he took that also to Africa. In Senegal, we have a program like that. He took his struggle against hunger. He took that to Africa to convince African governments that it's not because you are poor that your people must starve. You can be a poor country, but everybody has the right to food. So all his life, in addition to democracy, has been, and also when he was a trade unionist defending the right of the workers, all his life it has been a commitment to advancing the rights of the people through trade union, through government, through his institute. And human rights are the foundation for peace and justice. So when you work for human rights like Mandela did, he got the Nobel Prize. I think Lula should receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on economic rights, on anti-poverty, on education, on affirmative action in order to end racism. So irrespective of what he does when he comes out of prison, which I hope will be very soon, I think that for the work that he has done as a trade unionist, as a president, as a leader of an institution, all of that, given also the spread of its intervention at the global level, yes, for me, if you have two politicians in this 21st century who are the personification of what the Nobel Prize represents, then it is Nelson Mandela and Lula.
So how come a man of such importance and such achievements is in prison?
Well, don't ask Michel Temer.
Okay, thank you so much for
Okay.
your time.
You're welcome.
Talking to us.
Okay,
Very, very good. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can you send me a
Yes,
link
Yeah,
of this?
sure.